Architectural thinking today unfolds in an environment where images, data, and technical systems do not simply frame our work, they infiltrate it. Architecture no longer operates only on plots and plans, but within informational and image-saturated conditions in which every drawing, model, and rendering already participates in a larger media ecology. In such a landscape, it becomes difficult to maintain a clear line between representation and construction, between what we describe and what we actively bring into being. The question is no longer only what architecture shows, but what kind of worlds it composes when it writes with images and information. Our guest today has spent the last years working precisely in this interval. Riccardo Matteo Villa is an architect and postdoctoral researcher at the Research Unit for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technics at TU Wien. His work moves between architectural theory, the philosophy of techniques, media studies, and questions of architectonics in contemporary information environments. In his doctoral research on entropy, architecture, image, and information, he examines how architectural thinking can operate within rather than outside of these conditions. For this episode, we take up a notion that runs through his recent work and teaching. Architectural epos, the interval between mythos and logos in which architectural reasoning can be constituted. Instead of treating architecture as an applied recipient of external academic formats, he asks what happens when architecture generates its own ways of writing, its own standards, its own epic mode. How does this reframe our understanding of sight as something not only found but composed, of program as more than a list of functions, and of the problematic as the epic hinge between what is given and what is projected? These are the themes that will guide us in the episode ahead. I'm your host, Irene Ventilier. Welcome to Contrapposto. Thank you, Riccardo, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so before we begin, I want you to allow me a few minutes just to outline the general topic that frames the current series. So we are concerned with three terms every architect knows pretty well. We have site, we have program, and we have what I would like to call the problematic. So they appear constantly in briefs, in reviews, studios, and they are, I believe, in a certain way, slightly overlooked or taken for granted. At least the first two. With the second, I'm still on the fence what exactly it could mean, but we're trying to find out. So the aim would be a bit to reopen them, not to redefine, but to consider what they allow us to think or rethink in the current climate, whether in research or in practice. So we ask then, what do we call a site? Is it simply a parcel defined by limits or regulations? Or can it be understood in this broader sense, encompassing all the different layers, so from historical to socioeconomic to cultural, ecological? Also, what do we mean by program? Is it merely a list of functions, a brief, or can it be in any way, form, or fashion, negotiated, expanded? And then with the problematic, and this one I believe to be a bit slightly harder to articulate, because we can talk in the same vein about concept or a theme. I don't want to talk about problems, but problematics, I believe, carries with itself slightly different weight. We should also not talk about solving problems. I think problematic is about that either. Rather, I would see problematic as a constellation of tensions within the project, and at the same time, a certain stance one might need to take or would like to take with the project. Or perhaps even like a mediator between the site and the program. So as far as you are concerned, Riccardo, the way I like to frame today's discussion is around this topic or this notion, which I know you like to work with. You even had a seminar at a specific point, and this is the notion of epos. But before we jump into that, now this is a very long monologue on my part. But before we jump into this notion of epos, and how we can relate it to the architectural thinking, I think it would be wise to foreground a bit who it is that we're speaking with today. So welcome once again. Thank you very much for being here. Let me toss the ball to you. So who is Riccardo Villa? Let's say, what's your worldview on one hand and what's your research trajectory into the present day?
Yeah, bold beginning. Yeah. Thanks again for inviting me. So I'm as you announced me, I'm Riccardo Villa, and I'm currently I am a postdoc researcher and lecturer at the Research Unit for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technics at the University of Technology of Vienna, so TU Wien. I also have a side course that I'm a visiting scholar also at University of Florida, but we can discuss this also later. And let's say my worldview, my research trajectory. Well, I am also an architect, and I used to work as an architect. I studied architecture in Milan, and then I worked as an architect in Brussels for several years. But then I was always involved in research and writing, and I was more into contemporary history and criticism of architecture. And then at the time, I was looking for making this my full-time occupation. So I was looking for a PhD, and I somehow bumped into Vera Böhlmann, who is now directing the research unit here in Vienna. And I started working on something, on the idea of image and of architectonics of images, in the sense that I was fascinated at the time by this. I was always a bit fascinated by this somehow contradiction between our claim, or our kind of contemporary scientific claim of what perhaps Weber would call a Wertfreiheit, and also a kind of freedom from values, a kind of a goal to achieve a transparent vision over things, and this kind of impossibility of doing so, or perhaps the non-necessity of doing that. And I think this had a lot to do with architecture as a discipline that does not necessarily aim for purity of vision or any kind of purity, but in a way makes it so that purity is coexistence with dirt or filth, to quote one of our recent publications, so that is able to operate in this environment, which is a space of mixture, while accommodating these different things. So I did this PhD, which was called actually Upon Entropy and Architectonics, the Image in the Age of Information, where I developed specifically this vis-a-vis the topic of so through the lens of the image. So moving from this kind of almost philosophical bias towards the image that is always something, as with the board and with Plato to a certain extent, and with other authors. So it's always something that gets in the way of a pure vision of things. But I also approached it through architecture history, or actually historiography, so the writing of history, through theology, through philosophy, and ultimately through quantum physics and information theory, which was also my way to kind of have a bridge between what were my interests and the ones also of the chair. So, and then from then on, I'm starting more to focus, let's say, content-wise, and more interested in the idea of architecture as a contract. So as a contract that is not just a social contract, but could be also a natural contract, to say it with Michel Serres. And this in a double lens. On the one hand, towards the word, so towards the idea of Anthropocene, for instance, how can we understand Anthropocene precisely, as you were saying, maybe not as a problem to solve, but as a problematic, so as a space of things that are there that we might coexist with. And then on the other hand, on a more focused, less cosmic, but nevertheless to a certain extent still cosmic scale, the question of artificial intelligence. Also, how can we understand, again, artificial intelligence not as a solution, as a problem-solving tool, but as an instrument that let us inhabit the world, dwell in the world, in novel ways, or in ways that 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 might be different or not from the past. And these are my, let's say, 2 lines of research. And then on a methodic scale, was the Epos course that I developed. Yeah, that I'm happy you picked up, because I was living. I mean, I left a bit behind. I mean, also because recently, then yeah, maybe we'll talk about it later. I also worked on a publication that was somehow the outcome also of this. Was a way to experiment this method in practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it had a lot to do with the question how to write today, so how to write today in the age of AI, and how to write as architects, so not as just a scientist, how to write as architect. Therefore, this idea of image that I was speaking before. So this is in big strokes my concerns.
Yeah, I mean, we will talk later a bit about the new publication that you worked on Fritz Haller.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but just a bit to deepen the frame. So you operate at the intersection of multiple disciplines, we can say. So, as you said, with your PhD thesis, you moved from theology to media theory to quantum physics. Do you think it is like an interdisciplinary position that you developed for yourself, or is it just architecture and architectonics that is one of your concerns?
Yeah, I mean, with the words of today, this would be called perhaps interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. However, I'm not really too fond of these terms in a way, because they're a bit like brands or kind of tags that we have to use to make ourselves look more, I don't know, attractive or purchasable in the field of science as a kind of market. And on the other is because I think I would rather say it's architectonic and has to do with architecture, precisely because it does not conceive science as, I don't want to conceive science or the disciplines as different territories. So they're not this kind of geometric areas that maybe overlap. But so I think what is interesting more with architectonics and with architecture is more a kind of almost vertical or an axial, a vertical vector that transcends this kind of repartition of disciplines. So according to which I am the expert of a certain field, and if some topic goes outside of my field, this is not my expertise. I don't like this kind of approach. And I think, again, this is where architecture is very different from many other practices and disciplines, because, as an architect, when you worked as an architect and, working as an architect, I also felt this on my own, you can never say, no, but this is not my expertise. So if something goes wrong in any case, so in the engineering, in the design, in the electric, so you are always responsible, even if this was not your task, but you have this kind of oversight of things and responsibility of things, which I think is something that could be very interesting to bring also to precisely to science and to research, as this kind of, to break this kind of disciplinary breakdown of territories.
Yeah, I think it's Ludger who always positions. So he always says that architecture is like the heading of all other disciplines, is not a discipline in itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the name itself. So architecture is a kind of principal art, or it has There's also a very nice phrase from I think Aristotle that compares architecture and politics as a sovereign, as sovereign sciences of art. It does actually give not even a precise specification of what they are. They're kind of abilities. So, but they're the highest ones. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is already quite a rich expose you made. I believe we can already jump towards this notion I mentioned earlier. So, this notion of epos, I've heard you talk about it in one of your seminars, Epos and Architecture, and you engage with it as like a generative gap or middle between mythos and logos. So, but how do you define, or how do you articulate epos actually?
Yeah, I mean, so this started a bit actually, as you said, in a seminar. It was a PhD seminar, and the question was, how to write today as researchers in architects, and how to write in a way which does not either fall so just neither just passively adopts academic standards like the classic peer-reviewed paper, that this must be written with the state of the art and then findings, etc. Or, but not even neither just fall in this kind of, let's say, new postmodern, everything is fiction. So how to do something which is in that sense again architectonic. So no, that is not neither falls in so to call science, neither goes just to art or fiction, but does something with both. And this was the idea how to bring mythos and logos together. This idea of logos as a kind of purity of reasons, and mythos as a fiction that is also almost pure content. Because myth is this kind of formless, or at least it's this kind of stories that is always retold in different ways and in different times, in different formats, in tragedy, in stories, etc. So something that abstracts from form. So how to wave the two things together? So to look actually at the method of writing, of an actual, so looking almost at writing as a construction that therefore would be able to accommodate content in a way which is scientific, not because it looks or it sounds scientific, but because it has a certain mathematics in it. So it has something which is which is more, has to do more with method with the proofs or proving that the content is true. So with a purity of truth in that sense. I don't know if it was clear.
Yeah, but in this sense, architecture is you take architecture as a form of writing, right? Yeah. So, but this is not description. It's not descriptive in the sense that but is rather constitutive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, but what does this shift allow us to produce?
Well, I think the interesting thing is precisely this point that you were mentioning, that is not descriptive. So what you were then, so the goal of this is to produce artifacts, so texts that are somehow models, so they embody and they perform what they tell us. So you're not just reading an account or a description of how things works, but you are seeing while reading or experiencing while reading how this thing works. And this is, I think, this shift from, I think there's a nice way to phrase it. I mean, I'm a bit influenced recently because I was reading this text by Susan K. Langer, so philosophy in the UK, and she talks about the shift from discursive to I think she mentioned presentation, also from discourse to presentation of things. So it's not a representation of things. So it's not a depiction ex post of things, but it's a way in which while making this picture, you actually, in a way, engender the thing itself, or you make it so that the thing comes to life. Of course, it has to do with also my interest in the image and how also architecture treats images and representation, not as a depiction of something that is already there and therefore I have to copy, but as a copy that anticipates what has to be there. So there's this kind of anticipatory and projectual or projective character of architecture in that. And I was looking, so having worked on the PhD on the character of the image with Epos, I was thinking, okay, how can we bring this to text, for instance, especially vis-a-vis today, where we start to have a lot of generative, so to say, instruments for writing, with artificial intelligence and so on. So how to embrace this shift rather than trying to fight it, or even worse, trying to describe it, or to just take this kind of passive seer position.
But then you see this epos of architecture and epos as a kind of dramaturgy, where you have different elements performing against each other.
This could
Am
be
I
one of
understanding
the
this?
options. I think that the reason why I chose epos and not, for instance, theater or tragedy,
Mm-hmm.
which are also interesting because tragedy and comedy, but especially tragedy, deals with myth and it sets it up in an architectonic manner, but in a very interesting manner. So this idea also, I think today is a bit lost. But I love, for instance, how in tragedy there's no solution. No, it's tragedy because you cannot say who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. So everybody is kind of good and bad at the same time. There's this kind of impossible symmetry. But I would say that what my interest was in Epos is that so Epos in that sense is a bit pre-specific to tragedy. It's about this rhapsody, so this waving of things. It's still pre-specific if you want to a certain extent to writing. Also, epic poems were transcribed, but were initially orally. They were let's say preserved by oral transmission. And therefore, the forms in which the rhythms and the forms and the metrics in which this can be articulated are still, in that sense, open. So they're not necessarily theatrical or fabulative. So in that sense, I liked a bit the kind of incandescence, to call it with Serre. So this kind of still pre-specific character of epos that I was interested in investigating. And then with Epos, there was also these two things that was interesting. So the way I myself try to articulate this model is to look into, so with epic poetry, you have this idea of rhapsodies, of waving together of things. And then I cited it with the idea of ekphrasis, which is also present in the Iliad. So you have these two. I use this as a kind of methodological construction through the course. So to write according, so keeping in mind these two vectors. So one is the one of rhapsody, so how things weave together almost musically, so not just logically. And on the other hand, this idea of ekphrasis, so of using objects not as things to be merely describes, but as things that provide us a lens to cast a cosmos. No, so this came from the idea of the famous ekphrasis of the shield of Achilles that is described in the Iliad, and then actually is a description of an object that leads through a description of another story. So it becomes the object becomes somehow a literary device, almost a kind of lens. No, so these two things were a way in which I try to then think of the spectrum that Epos could open up to.
Yeah, but just a bit for my thing, that is clear for me a bit. So you have these two vectors, the rhapsody and the ekphrasis, and you also have the mythos and the logos. But with mythos and logos, you create a kind of suspension that you don't want to shift to either one of them, right?
Yeah. So there is, if you want, a kind of dramaturgy or a sense, so that as a kind of forward to the or as an introduction to the course and to the method. It was precisely, it was a way to give a dramatization or to characterize these two poles. So to say, okay, what if we think there are these two poles, which are the ones of this kind of mythos, which is irrational, which has paradoxes, which has things that cannot be solved logically, and the one of logos that tries himself to purify these kind of things, and say, okay, what if we find something that can accommodate one into the other, no? So without choosing for one, so without seeing them as a logical antinomy, but by building them together as an architectonic construction. And this was the Epos, yeah.
Okay, so they get weaved together in the end. Logos and mythos get weaved.
Yeah.
Way. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So there's not a refusal of fiction, and there's not a refusal of science in that sense. No? So it's but it's also not a way to make fictions about science, or to fictionalize science. It's a way to, it's my interest was more so because when you fictionalize science, then science gives the main picture, is determinative, and then fiction becomes this kind of ornament that makes it more digestible. No, it's also the two are equivalent in that sense in the idea of epos. So there's not one which is determining the other, so to say. They're between kind of quantum relation. Yeah.
That is very interesting, and I really like the idea that architecture can really develop its own format of writing rather than adopting one which is exterior to it.
Mm-hmm.
And with this, I want to make the jump to this overall topic of side program and problematic. I'm still I'm still thinking whether we should place the side program problematic into how to deal with it in research and in writing, or how to deal with it in design.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to put, in any case, I would like to put it in this light of Epos. I think it can shed some light on how we can deal with all three of them and under the umbrella of Epos.
Mm-hmm.
So we have Epos as a compositional mode. How do you think about the site? How do you treat the sites? Or how did you used to treat the site when you were practicing architect? What is a site now for you?
Yeah, I think again, in architecture is interesting because a site in architecture, I think, is never, or at least when you do good architecture, is never something simply found. It's something in a way which is invented. So it's as much found as projected. No, I remember when I was a student in architecture, my teachers were always saying, because you always have this moment of analysis and then project. No, so first you do the analysis and then the project. And some of my teachers were like, well, actually careful, because whenever you do analysis, the analysis is already a project. So there is not just a kind of innocent look you give, but you're already building through. So be aware of this, so that the analysis you make is already somehow oriented towards what you want to build in a way. And this, I think, is something which is which is also valid for, or I mean, at least it's something that I also brought in with this idea of Epos. So the idea of I think the site under the light of Epos is something a bit like maybe like the thread of Penelope. And also she kind of weaves and unweaves this kind of thread, which is actually representing or is depicting the story in which herself is in. So no, again, she's not just there in something pre-existing that contains her, but what contains her is also contained by her, and then is weaved and unweaved by her. So I think this is an interesting mise en abîme, so an interesting figure to look at it. And in architecture, I mean, there's this quote by Ram Koolhaas that I always like to quote, that because he started precisely as a writer, no? So he was not initially an architect, but he was a writer, and then he became to be a very successful architect. And then once he was interviewed regarding, I think, Delirious New York, and then he said about it that he wanted to construct as a writer a terrain where he could eventually work as an architect. So this idea of constructing a terrain in writing where then you can work as an architect, I think, is an interesting, almost paradox, or is interesting actually image to look at how to conceive of the site as something which is not just there we go and we look and we try to find legitimization for our project in the existing, but something that's actually, maybe it's actually what we actually build. No, so even the past of the site is not something given, but it's what we are able to build. No, this is also a bit this idea of the retroactive manifesto within. But so where everything is, so all the datum, all the given is still to be coded, and the coding matters. So the coding is also influencing what we receive and the way we receive it.
So we can actually go then to program. So because I want to link it with this weaving and unweaving, I'm curious if this works out. So traditionally, a program is a list of functions that you impose a kind of linear logic on the project. In this framework that we just outlined, is program then a kind of, do you think it's a kind of narrative or a discursive construction, like with Rem Koolhaas, internal to the project?
I think, I mean, one thing, since you were, since we were talking about Koolhaas, what was interesting in his work was that for me, it was precisely this introduction of program as something which is unlinked or it's emancipated from function, so from certain functionalism. No? So this idea of architecture, so with bigness and then typical plan, etc., as a kind of hardware, so to say, that can contain, that becomes an environment like an operating system for many softwares. No? So then program becomes a kind of, programs become different things that can run on this hardware, rather than architecture having a form that somehow, in a banal way, so to say, follows function. Also, then therefore a specific form for every specific function. Also, his interest was this idea of, okay, what if architecture, is more this our computer, no? So a kind of hardware that then can have many functions that at this point are not functions anymore, but programs. So in that sense, I think there is a certain liberation there. I think, though, you're right to point out that still today the idea of program is pretty much linked to a certain functionality, or so what you call a functional script. And I think what we could start thinking of the way in which we can start thinking of this idea of program or programming is could also be helped by this distinction, for instance, in computer science, for instance, between imperative programming and declarative coding. No, so not thinking of programming precisely as a kind of functional operation, but as something which becomes more, rather than a line, more a kind of a space or an environment in which to play. So a space not in which the program solves a particular problem, but where it opens up a spectrum of things. So now we always say not speaking of solutions, but of resolutions. No, so and therefore, and this is also very architectural. No, so in architecture you don't have just a solution to a problem, but you have a resolution. So you can have many different kind of houses. No, so there's not just one way to solve the necessity of dwelling, for instance, to speak in very simple terms. And therefore, I think, we could start thinking of the program also in this way. So more in this almost kind of a poetry. And this is where then my collaboration with Rutger Hovenstadt from ATH was interesting, because he is an architect and a computer scientist that is really interested in looking precisely into programming as this kind of almost poetry. Yeah.
But then, do you think, just to link it with the Penelope, the weaving and unweaving, you mentioned it with the site, is then the program weaves into this? So you unweave, when we analyze the site, let's say you perform a kind of unweaving, and then you weave again the program or your project through the program on the site, that it becomes a continuous.
No, I think the weaving and unweaving cannot be understood as a kind of 2 steps or 3 steps process. So it's not the temporality, or in these things is always, everything is always contemporary, in the sense where while you weave, you also unweave. So they cannot be separated as different processes. No, and this, you could speak of rather weaving and weaving as coding and decoding, no, and as 2 acts of the process of coding in itself. Therefore, I think whenever you approach a site, all these 2 things. So what the program does is weave and unweave at the same time. So you don't. So as soon as you claim that you're unweaving the site, you're already weaving it. So there cannot be a separation between the 2.
Yeah, and I really like this, and I heard you talk. I've heard this from you many times, that it's not about solution, it's about resolutions in architecture. And I think in the back of my head, this is precisely what the problematic is about. It shouldn't be about solving a specific problems in a certain way, being determinative in this kind of way, but it's about finding the kind of tension that gives you a spectra of solutions where you can choose or pick one that is more suitable or less suitable or whatever fits. Do you see the problematic or this kind of tension between site and program? What do you think this triangular dynamic plays in Epos? How do you think this plays in Epos?
So perhaps maybe just to take a step back, I think because I didn't we didn't really talk about the idea of problems and problematic, which is not something really in my vocabulary, but it's something I think you are concerned with, and I find it interesting because yeah, also the moving from problematic. I remember when I was at school and I was studying ancient Greek, we had this little book which was called Problemata, which was an exercise book of where you could train your skills in ancient Greek. And I think there is perhaps one thing that we didn't mention is that yeah, this is precisely this space of resolution, let's say, of where let's say your goal, which is I don't know to learn Greek, is spectralized through different exercises. But there's also a component which is interesting, which is the one of training. No, so the one that I think problematics bring is this idea of training and imitate, the necessity of training and imitation. So in that sense, maybe linked to the idea of program, it unlinks the program from this kind of idea that you can have just a mechanical or a mere, well, more than mechanical, as a kind of mere calculus of things where you, I don't know, you write a line and this is performed no matter what, but it introduces the idea of imitation and the necessity of a certain training for things. No, that I think is also linked with my interest also in Epos as something, as a writing that is not just a format that you adapt and then it's guided, is a kind of automatic gives you an automatic result, but it's something that needs to be cultivated through different cycles, different imitations of models, a bit more like in a garden, if you want. So it's really a matter of cultivation of your ability. And I think this is something which I think nicely the term that you introduced, problematic, can bring back now. So this idea of exercise yeah, and also in problema in Greek as this is a throwing in front. So there's almost a kind of gymnastics to it that is implied, no? So, and I think it's also very timely because then it links. So for anyone that is using I don't know, things like ChatGPT today or these kind of instruments, you know that they're precisely not input-output tools. So they're not things where you say, okay, I want this reply telling, but they're more kind of discursive. They need a bit of training and learning are terms that are reintroduced in this context, in a context where before, why would we need the computer to learn? The computer already knows because it has the data, no? But now it needs to learn. It needs to go through this kind of problematics itself, no? So I think that in that sense is interesting. And then, yeah, to link the epos to this is precisely to think of, you know, again, of this kind of how to retell the story, how to imitate models in order to retell a certain story according to different things, and how to learn how to tell this story, you know? So in a way which is, again, not a mere matter of transparent input and output, but it gets a characterization and almost a dramaturgy in that sense, yeah.
But then you as an author, you need to take also a stance when you need to position yourself in all of these things in the middle of these things.
Yeah, definitely. So you're not, and in a way, you become, yeah, kind of composer of all these things, or a rhapsode. So there could be different characterizations to it, and so there is a persona who is shaped as an author, which at the same time is not anymore this idea of the author that owns or is the one that is in possession or is owning the contents. Now, this idea of intellectual property is somehow eroded, which is, I don't think, is that much a bad thing. No, especially in a scientific context. This is good that this is somehow threatened, in my understanding, but not just for the sake of threatening, but because then you, as an author, you get still a face and a responsibility which is not merely linked to the capitalization of what you produce. So it's in a way liberated from a certain if you want, a certain capitalism of scientific production. And then once you start to think on these terms, or one example I always do in this course on artificial intelligence is, on one hand you have this idea of solution to resolutions, but also this idea of thinking of all of these things, not in terms of tools, but of instruments. And I always say, a tool like a hammer, when you work with a hammer, you're just yourself, so you remain yourself. But when you use an instrument like a piano, you become a pianist. So in that sense, there is this kind of idea of the author or the subject that does something is not just merely a subject that receives things. You become, to say it with Heidegger, but it becomes an active persona, which is, so I'm not anymore, let's say, myself or merely myself. I become something more or something else. Now, so I become a pianist. I have this kind of almost contractual persona between me and the instrument and I don't know, the realm of music, which is achieved through this.
Yeah, in a way, you cannot be a hammerist, as you always say.
Yeah, exactly. I
Be a
cannot.
violinist.
That was the missing point. You cannot be a hammerist when you work. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe we can invent that at some point to become two hammerists.
Yeah, just to make a brief jump into artificial intelligence, because you are teaching this course on ethics also.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you see artificial intelligence as an instrument, is not a tool?
Yeah, definitely. So this is also the idea of ethics. So there's all this kind of again, a kind of dramatization, a bit like mythos and logos that I think is always useful to do. And so with artificial intelligence, it's very useful to speak of instruments and not of tools. Also because, as I was saying before, I mean, most let's say I mean, this is true for artificial intelligence at large, but mostly, but also for computers, let's say. That's but yeah, specifically with artificial intelligence, there is an interesting phenomenon, if you want, that whenever you try to use it as a tool, so as something that solves your problem, I mean, it doesn't perform as well as something which is meant to solve the problem. So it's more this kind of spectrum that it opens. Whereas where you work with it in terms of instruments, so as a kind of things that needs to be tuning, and then that is more working in terms of a spectrum rather than in terms of output. It's much more performative and much richer. And this is also where the idea of ethics comes in, because it's not, then ethics has to do this. I always contrast it in the course with the idea of morals, because oftentimes we speak of ethics and morals interchangeably. So we say something is unethical when we mean actually immoral. But I think what is interesting to make a distinction there is that with morals you have a kind of guidelines. No? So you say you know what is moral and what is not moral. So it's not more, is it moral to kill, and so in that sense you have a kind of picture of the word that is helping to guide you through it. The idea of ethics is in a way the inverse to it. The ethics, I think the ethical spectrum arises whenever there are no guidelines for decision. So where you open, where there's this, yeah, precisely, there is this spectrum of different solutions that you were calling before, but then there's no actual external legitimization to say this is better than the other. So somehow you have to make a choice and be responsible for that choice. And then again, by being responsible, again, you get a face, so you get a persona, and also getting this idea of the pianist and the hammerist. And therefore, there's a different architecture there that arises. And I think the way we approach artificial intelligence today is still pretty much in terms of morals and morality and of policies, of guidelines, which is not necessarily wrong, but I think it's important in order to not even to understand, but to better live with it in a way, is more interesting to address it in terms of ethics, no? And in that sense, architecture again is a privileged point of view. I think there is that's another interesting formulation. There's this office in Brussels called Dogma. It's an architecture office, and once they were asked, okay, but why did you call yourself Dogma? And the reply was, if I'm not mistaken, was something like, well, architecture is like a dogma because it's a decision upon the undecidable, which is very interesting. That has also to do with my interest in upon entropy, also this idea of when things becomes indifferent and undecidable, and nevertheless you have to cast a shape or can make a decision, trace the line, and precisely as something that is not legitimized by another power or by something outside of itself. So I think this is, let's say, the architecture of things that I'm interested in these constellations.
I think this gives us now a very rich conceptual frame within which we can situate the rest of this discussion, and namely with your newest editorial project, which is the book on Fritz Haller, which you added with Ludger Hofstadt and with Vera Bühlmann, or was it called Jointing Things on Fritz Haller? Yeah, it's in 2 volumes. Has it already been published, or is it?
It's about to be published. I just received today that the contract and everything is signed, and I think it should be published by the end of this month, if I'm not mistaken. Well, we'll see.
So it's, I'm just looking now a bit at the description of it. So 2 books explore the nature and potential of architecture in the age of artificial intelligence, and it is inspired by architect Fritz Haller, where a virtual persona asks him about the architecture of the future. The first book uses artificial intelligence to network the Internet of Things into a new architecture. The second presents 6 works by Fritz Haller in the multidisciplinary light of the 2020s and shows them like icons that already contain what was only thought of later. Neither historical nor analytical, but visionary and projective, and in some respects represent an experiment in themselves. They show an architecture that does rethink and does not evaluate.
Is this the description on the website, or?
Yes.
Okay. It's the first time I hear it. It's interesting.
Really? Yeah, so first of all, who is Fritz Haller? Because I've been talking with some people and they are not very familiar with who Fritz Haller actually is. Can you?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting story, because this whole book, the genesis of this book came for the fact that Vera Bühlmann and I were working on a book series that now on the idea of a book series about architectonics at large, so that would resonate with our interest and the interest of the research unit in Vienna. And while thinking about books, at some point I thought, okay, but why don't we ask Ludger Hofstadt at ETH to make a book about Fritz Haller? Because Fritz Haller used to be actually the mentor initially of Ludger Hofstadt, of Professor Hofstadt. And it happened to be that last year, I think it was exactly 100 years from the birth of Fritz Haller. And one thing is, and then Ludger, so by talking to Ludger, he asked me if I could do this book, and then I said, okay, why don't we do it together? And then this is how the 2 books came to be. But then it's true, when I was sometimes when I was talking to people, say, okay, I'm doing a bit of a book concerning Fritz Haller, even people that were in architecture history, oftentimes, or in architecture, even in sometimes in Switzerland, were not too familiar with the name, which I found surprising. But then very interesting, whenever I said, I was once, I remember I was with a colleague from ETH, and I said, and we were in a cafe, in a very architectural designy cafe in Zurich, and we were discussing about this, and we were sitting on the sofa, and behind me I had this OSM furniture, so this OSM Haller furniture actually, and which is actually much more famous in a way than Fritz Haller himself, but it's called Wissam Haller Furniture. And she was like, I don't know, who is that? And I was like, I just said this, the guy that this. This was a kind of a funny story. I said, yes, of course. And then, but but it's true that it's a figure that is still very much him, and Therese Beider, who was also the photographer of all these works, and then produced many also the drawings about it. They're quite still in the shadows. And this was interesting to see while also going to the archive at ETH that has a lot of stuff about them from them. And it was interesting to start to start, let's say, opening up or starting shedding a light a bit on this figure. I think until now there was mostly just one main book done, but it was only in German and there was nothing yet still in English. So I was a bit frightened and honored at the same time to be invested with this task of making one of the first English written book about Haller, which is at the same time is a very peculiar, as you read, the description is not a conventional book at all. So it does not talk that much about Haller. Let's say it does not describe at least Haller that much, but it talks through Haller in a way. So in both books. So yeah.
Yes, how would you then? What's the concept behind it?
Yeah, so the idea first while thinking, okay, how could we do that? And how could we do it in the context of a collaboration with Ludger Hovestad? I thought of precisely of translating or of adopting this idea of rhapsody and ekphrasis that I was talking about before in Epos. And also it was the same period where I was working on Epos. And I said, okay, but why don't we do a book which is more, let's say, rhapsody? So it's more a weaving together of things. And this would be the book that Ludger took care of. And it's a weaving, which is, it's a computational rhapsody. So Ludger in his research has, let's say, built this instrument, which has to do with mathematical lambda calculus. That is basically like, it's a computational pen to write poems in a way. I don't know how to describe it. So it's able to source things or to sound more than 1 million books, I think. So words and recurrences and patterns from more than 1 billion books. So any kind of books, and then to source these things a bit like almost like a wizard or a necromancer to orchestrate according to what is interesting. And then it's hard to describe as a thing. It's more something that one has to read and to see written and placed on the page. But it's this kind of computational weaving of things. So it's a book in that sense. It's a jointing of things. And this book in my concept was a kind of mathematics of things. No, sorry, a mathematics of jointing.
Mm-hmm.
And the other book which I edited was more an ekphrastic kind of book. So it would take different objects or different projects from Haller. So one per scale. So we had from the let's say the node, the idea of jointing itself, which is central in Haller. So this is what also Haller learned, let's say, from Konrad Waxman, that wrote a book which is precisely I think the title is Architecture is the Art of Jointing. I think it's something like that. And then it starts from this idea of how to joint different things. Then there is the idea then there is the furniture, then there is architecture, then there is the city, the infrastructure, until the cosmic, so the space station. So, and I took they sample, let's say, this different project, and I gave them each one to a different author. And I asked this author not to describe, so not to give us a historical description of the project, but to light the projects as kind of lenses that would be colored through their own interests. So I asked a mathematician to write about the jointing. I asked a composer and a musicologist to write about the furniture, an architect to write about a house. Then we had an artist that wrote about the infrastructure. The city. Then we had the writer that gives interviews, so collects interviews about the infrastructure, and a philosopher that writes about the space colony. So to give a bit this kind of different colors, a bit almost like in a way like this Western furniture that can be filled with different colors. And this was also, I mean, in a way, was also the question was also resonating with on the one hand, with Ludger's interest that he always raises in a way in what is architecture if computers can do what architecture we think it is. So what is beyond, but also still architecture. And my way was, so I had also a little bit of a background in architecture history. And my question in this specific project was how to write a book about an architect, not as a historian. So not as historians, but as architects, no? So that by not just adopting, again, the usual logos of historiography, you know, so where you just divide the territory of these objects and you try to describe this object from different perspective, but nevertheless they give a kind of historicized picture, but really to kind of activate the material and use it in a kind of in that sense, in a way, in an epic, in the way that I was interested in. So yeah, this was a bit the project, and then it's the first, I would say, it's the first experiment in this sense, and then I'm happy to see it soon printed and see if this how successful this is. But I think it's good to have it as a first kind of milestone in this field of experimentation. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you did not want to look at it from this historian point of view, or to treat it as a historical work.
Yeah.
I mean, you still
also
really...
there was already I mean, in that sense, it would also have been a double up. There was, as I was mentioning, there is already a very good book by my colleagues in Zurich that precisely looked at that. I mean, unfortunately, it's only in German, but there's this book it was already there. So therefore, I said, okay, if this is already there, what can we do? And also precisely by looking again at the site, not so to come back to your question of the site, the historical site, not as a domain of resources that you can exhaustively map, but as a kind of source that can be articulated in different cases, different ways, and it's not about about closing or giving an exhaustive or true picture, but it's more about this weaving. So using Haller as a code for things almost, which is also interestingly fitting because of Haller's interest in architecture precisely as a jointing of things, and also as to find a way to join things across different scales. So not so was to a certain extent. I mean, this is also, I write a bit in the introduction to the second volume, why doing such a thing with and why such an author is so interesting in these terms.
But do you think then that this architectural history is a source or a resource for speculation rather than kind of verification of who Fritz Haller was, but speculation of what comes after him through his work?
It could definitely be. I mean, I think my interest when I was a student in architecture history was precisely that there is, I mean, I also come from, I studied in Milan where there is a tradition. My mentor there was Marco Biraghi, who also wrote a book on Manfredo Tafuri. And let's say this line of thought approaches history precisely not as let's say, to see it as a way to reconstruct things as things they exactly were. I think this was a quote by I don't remember, it was this German scholar that precisely said history should be the verification of things as they were, as exactly they were. But the idea of reconstruction always presupposes that history is always a construction of things. No? So we always have to embrace this paradox by doing history, that it's always a model. It's always a matter. Any kind of history, even not history that is not architectural, has always architecture within it. So it's always architectonic in a certain extent. And to ignore this, so again, to claim this transparency, to ignore this is, then it is a fallacy in that sense also. And then the question is, what you do? Do you kind of surrender in front of this tragedy, or kind of celebrate this tragedy a bit like Trapuri does, or do you just embrace it and start articulating modern? So you go more into comedy, you know. So not in the sense that it's funny, but in the sense of the Greek comedy, you know. So that there's a plenty of things coming out of this site, so to say.
I think we're closing towards the end of the discussion. I have two more questions for you. One is related to this Fritz Haller book.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you, so this mode of reading that you've developed, mode of really reading and composing, does this expand the architectural literacy beyond this merely documentation and analysis? And I will tie this with more general questions in that we have all these shifts in the technological landscape and all these developments in which architecture operates. So then what forms of literacy should architects cultivate today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, they're quite interlinked in the sense that I think the aim of, or let's say the guiding desire of a project like the one of Haller is in a way to expand indeed the literacy of architects, but not just of architects, just to the idea of, and not even maybe to expand, but to cultivate literacy. It's really like more about cultivation than a kind of expansion, because I think expansion plays again this kind of implies that there's a territory and to be expanded. But I think it's more a kind of cultivation, so an insistence, a vertical insistence of on the site in order to make the site grow, but not as territorially. And in that sense, I think is one instance and then one way in which one model in which one can try to do that. But then, so if you ask what form of literacy can architects cultivate today, I would say I would not point to one or another, but I would say in general, any form that does not make them too much a specialist into something. Also, then try to avoid the narrow insist or I mean, I have some colleagues, for instance, maybe not from architecture, but from academia that are like, yeah, you know, I specialize in, I don't know, hospitals in south of Germany between 1933 and 1935, because that's basically the free spots that was there for them to, nobody talked about it. And I think, no, just go for something even bolder, no, to specialize on everything in that sense. And I think what is interesting with architecture is to keep these two. So this idea of so when someone, for instance, is an architect, you know, wants to become, I don't know, an expert in, I don't know, again, hospitals or certain kind of hospitals, what it needs to do is not just look at hospitals, but at everything at the same time. Because I think the beauty of literacy and erudition and architecture is the fact that they all come from a kind of pollution and a kind of contamination from things that are completely alien to them. And the exercise there, or the challenge, is being able to cast bridges that are as most far between things as possible. Also, things that one wouldn't have thought. And I think all the people that I admire and I read and then that I learn from are precisely able to do that. And also, and they're able to connect things like such as, I know, architecture history with topics and sources and materials. That's let's say a kind of stereotypical figure of the architectural historian would have never thought of. No, so they read things that are completely alien to it, and they're able to build this to make contracts again between these completely alien agents or materials. So I think in that sense, yeah, I would say any kind of literacy that does that is worth cultivating.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because it seems this discussion whether an architect should be a generalist or a specialist seems to have resurfaced in all of the discussions that I had so far. And my 2 cents on this is that architects need to cultivate a skill or a way, cultivate abstraction, basically, to be able to navigate from what you just said, between all the different domains and all the different to connect what's alien to them to bring this into their projects.
Yeah, I think and it also has to do, is a way also to, if you want to rephrase this, what we were saying before with Penelope and the weaving, no? So it's the fact that it's not, I think, I'm not saying that the architect should not be a specialist, but it should be as much as a specialist as a generalist in that sense. So, and then I think abstraction is the key, is the fact of being able to forget or to unlearn things in order to learn them. So it is this kind of paradox. I think there's a nice quote that I was working with recently from one of the earliest books by Emanuele Coccia, this philosopher. He's an Italian philosopher who works in France, and now he's actually at TPFL in the architecture faculty. And he's speaking about study and what is study. And he said, well, study, we normally think that study is a kind of accumulation of knowledge. But actually study, he says, is the active production of infancy. So we produce infancy because infancy is the status or the condition in which we can contemplate knowledge as an absolute potency. So not as an actuality, but as an absolute potency. So anything, so it's kind of a formless state. And therefore to study, which does not mean to try to look at things with an innocent look. No, it's to precisely to actively produce this status. So the status in which we forget or we unlearn about things in order to learn them as most powerful in the most abstract way as possible. And therefore, in a way that they contain this potency and therefore this abstraction, so they can also things as which is would look completely unrelated to another, can be translated across very different domains. So I think this is a bit the challenge there for all of us, not just for architects, I would say, also for citizens.
Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the nice discussion.